announcement. Wednesday of this week, my class, Political Science 351, is to move to Swift 106 once more. After that, return to SS 122. The reason seems to be purely technical, not even administrative. Good. Now, at the beginning of this course, I said I would try to make visible to you the air which we all breathe, whether we know it or not. And I believe I did that by presenting to you the issue of positivism on the one hand and historicism on the other. This was necessary because political philosophy, as a quest for the just or the good society, has become incredible in our age owing to positivism and historicism. Possibly I cannot repeat naturally what I said in these 7 long sessions. Positivism leads to the contempt or neglect of political philosophy, of the political philosophies of the past. Historicism, on the other hand, must cultivate the history of political philosophy, although it can no longer recognize the possibility of political philosophy proper. Yet, closer inspection shows that even positivism cannot leave it at that contempt if it wants to fulfill its self-imposed duty. For the study of human societies, political societies, cannot limit itself to the study of institutions, etc. It must also take into consideration the ideologies. And within this context, it is compelled to discuss the political philosophies of the past. To take a simple example, which I believe I have used before, in order to understand the United States Constitution as it is now, one must of course understand it as it was understood by its framers, the original framers. And if one tries to do that, one is driven back in the first place to Montesquieu, the theoretical authority for Hamilton and Madison, and Montesquieu himself will not reveal his full message if we do not contrast his teaching with that of certain ancient thinkers, among them the historian Polybius. More generally stated, every attempt at rational knowledge, philosophic or scientific, consists in replacing opinions by knowledge. This cannot be conscientiously done if one does not first know the opinions from which one starts. But these opinions are only partly our opinions. Their most important part, or their largest part at least, is inherited. What we regard as our opinions consists to a considerable extent of the sediments of past discussions which were conscious, which were the focus of attention in earlier centuries, and now we live on their results. Hence, the non-historical concern with the clarification of our opinions, it insensibly shifts into historical studies. And to that extent, historicism is right with its assertion that philosophic or scientific questions cannot be separated from historical questions, or that a fusion of philosophy and history is indispensable. Historicism is superior to positivism owing to this awareness. In fairness to the founder of positivism, Kant, one must say that Kant was perfectly clear at this point. According to Kant, one cannot make clear what the scientific spirit is, except by means of a history of the human mind. One must see the earlier alternatives, the theological mind and the metaphysical mind, if one wants to see the scientific mind in its peculiarity and the superiority of the scientific spirit to the spirit of theology and metaphysics. There is an external sign of the fact that this need for historical studies is felt more and more within science. I have not made any statistical studies, but from some facts which have come to my attention, it seems that the interest in the history of science, i.e. of modern science, is now much greater than it was, say, 50 years ago. That a physicist of the rank of Einstein took the trouble of writing a history of physics is, I think, one of these straws in the wind. Now, regarding historicism, we have seen, according to it, the fundamental fact is a change in the absolute presuppositions, to use the term coined by Collingwood. We can say it's a change in the categories. Change cannot be explained. That's the reason why it is a fundamental fact. For the explanation of any explanation means the use of categories, of specific categories. And the validity of these categories is exactly the problem on the basis of historicism. You remember what I said, what I quoted to you from Nagel, that about the logically arbitrary and historically contingent character of the principle of causality as understood by modern science. The Marxist, for instance, believes it is able to explain the change of categories of the principles of understanding and action by tracing them to the relations of production, ultimately. But the question is whether the assumption of the primacy in the fundamental character of the relations of production is not itself historically relative, i.e. plausible under the conditions of the 19th and 20th century, but not simply true. The difficulty regarding historicism is this, that despite the fact that the change of absolute presuppositions is not a rational process, a progress from lesser to greater rationality, yet our absolute presuppositions, which include and which consist in the historical awareness, is of course said to be superior to all earlier thought. Now that superiority is a consequence or identical with the discovery of the historical character of all human thought, or as people say, with the experience of history as history or of historicity. This experience, whatever that may mean, is based somehow on historical evidence. And here we see again the fusion of philosophy and history. So historicism cannot clarify itself except through clarifying the position which it replaces, the non-historicist philosophy. At any rate, there exists agreement today as to the necessity of the history of political philosophy on the basis of the belief in the impossibility of political philosophy proper. In order to be reasonable, moderate, not extremist, or however you would like to call it, it is safest to begin, therefore, with the history of political philosophy, a subject the legitimacy of which is not denied by anyone today, except by people who are very obviously lacking in simple coherence of thought. But still, there will be one difference between the way we is not a pluralis majestatis, but I mean I and some people who think like me, we, in contradistinction to the positivists and historicists, approach the history of philosophy while we are open to the possibility that political philosophy as such is not impossible. And so I believe that this approach is less prejudiced, more open-minded than the positivist and the historicist approach. Now let us proceed in an orderly manner. We turn to the history of political philosophy, to the whole history of political philosophy, in principle at least. The first thing you have to do in such an enterprise is to divide it into periods. Otherwise, how can we find our bearings in this infinite mass of material? Now, the division into periods must not be arbitrary. How can we make it non-arbitrary? I would suggest, if we do not rely on our own poor judgment, but follow the views, the consciousness of the actors, in this case, of the great political philosophers. Now, if we turn to them, we learn, as good children, we have first to be docile and to listen to our betters, and later on we, of course, may also quiz them. Now, when we learn from Cicero that the founder of political philosophy was Socrates. Socrates was the one, according to Cicero, who brought down philosophy from heaven, brought it down to earth, and introduced it into the cities and houses of men, and compelled it to think about good and bad, and so on. So the whole story of political philosophy seems to begin with Socrates. But here we are in an embarrassing situation because Socrates did not write. The only things which he did write, as far as our knowledge goes, was 2 letters. When he had a discussion about justice and injustice, he drew up a list for the discussion and wrote down with Greek letters, of course, justice and injustice. And then he asked the interlocutor to enumerate the points. But still, at the end of the day, Socrates did not write books. So the oldest books available are those by Plato, Socrates' direct pupil, and by Aristotle, Plato's pupil. After Aristotle's time, almost within his lifetime, a new school emerged, because Plato founded a school, the academy, just as Aristotle founded a school called the Lyceum. And the third, later school is the so-called Stoic school. Here we know nothing have only fragments, and we have to rely chiefly on Cicero, who gives us coherent presentations, if very summary presentations, of the Stoic moral political doctrine. Now, all this development from Socrates to the Stoics, this I propose to call classical political philosophy. By this I do not wish to minimize the differences between Plato, Aristotle and the Stoics, but they have something fundamentally in common. They all build on a foundation led by Socrates. This classical political philosophy is the only political philosophy prior to the modern age. As for medieval political philosophy, we must distinguish within it between political theology, a political teaching based on revelation, which as such does not fall within the province of political philosophy, and political philosophy proper. Now, the political philosophy proper of the Middle Ages is fundamentally based on classical political philosophy, especially Aristotle. One of the boldest medieval thinkers, Dante, in his Monarchy, speaks of the absolute novelty of his enterprise in that work. That one has only to begin to read to it, one sees that it is based on Aristotle. Aristotle is the philosopher for Dante, and however original the proposal made in the Monarchy may be, the foundations are Aristotelian. At a certain moment a break occurred. Again, we do not trust our own impression, but look around and listen to these voices of the men of the past. Who were there who claimed to have done away completely with this political philosophy founded by Socrates, root and branch? And the loudest and clearest voice, there cannot be the slightest doubt about that, is that of Thomas Hobbes. And so, until further notice, we will assume that the break with classical political philosophy occurred in the work of Hobbes. And as I will already say now, a closer study would show that the break had occurred prior to Hobbes in the work of Machiavelli. But in Machiavelli, the claim to radical break is by far not as audible and powerful as in Hobbes. So we have then this very simple division from which we start. Classical political philosophy or pre-modern political philosophy and modern political philosophy. And the question which concerns us, since we are not merely historians, we cannot afford to be merely historians, this question is for us a quarrel. Which of the two is right? And this is a quarrel of the ancient and the moderns, la querelle des anciens et des modernes, as it was called in the 17th century. At that time, the famous quarrel was the quarrel about whether, say, the Dryden or Corneille were as good dramatists as Sophocles and Euripides, or Molière as good a comedian as Aristophanes. In other words, it appears to be primarily a literary question. But it is much more than that. The fundamental quarrel was that between modern philosophy, which includes modern natural science, and classical philosophy and classical science. The most famous document in the English language of that quarrel is Swift's Battle of the Books, and for those who read more carefully, Swift's Gulliver's Travels. But in this I cannot go now. Now, Hobbes questions all preceding political philosophy. They all were wrong and worse than wrong sophists. In the present day textbook version, which is of course not entirely unreasonable, it is very hard to say something which is entirely unreasonable, but nevertheless it is misleading. There was another tradition stemming from the sophists via the Epicureans and so on. This thing didn't exist for Hobbes. That was not political philosophy. That was a teaching which destroyed civil society, and not one which was tried to show a way toward a good civil or just civil society. That alone was political philosophy in Hobbes' sense. Now, Hobbes gives a long list in various places of these men, and Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are, of course, and Cicero are, of course, the greatest names. He doesn't say anything about the scholastics because, well, he wrote in a Protestant country, and you can say the Reformation had taken away this problem from Hobbes, although that's not quite true, because Richard Hooker was also an Anglican, and he made a great use of Thomas Aquinas. But he has a discussion of Cardinal Bellarmine, but in a very special context, in the context of ecclesiastical power, where he has to take issue with the claim of the Catholic Church, as stated by Bellarmine, that all ecclesiastical power is concentrated in the hands of the Pope. Now, what is wrong with these people, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so on? Hobbes says they are teachers of anarchy. Anarchists, a very strange assertion, it seems. Aristotle is anarchist. What does Hobbes mean by that? They laid the foundation for criticizing their governments. From the point of view of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, and so on, it is legitimate to criticize the governments if they misbehave, which does not necessarily mean that they justify rebellion. But you can surely, they made it possible, theoretically, to criticize governments. Think only of the concept of tyrant. So you have it very clear. In other words, they laid the foundation for the possible appeal from the law laid down by the government, the positive law, to natural law. That is historically correct. But Hobbes says, opposing them, that the command of natural law is to obey the positive law. Therefore, there is no possibility of appealing from the positive law to the natural law. And in the particular form which Hobbes gave his thought, it means, and this is in a way implied in what I said, government must be absolute in order to be government. And an absolute government is as such uncriticizable. Now, this criticism of Hobbes is crude criticism, but not groundless criticism, has an important implication. Namely, that Hobbes, to a considerable extent, agrees with the tradition which he attacks. Namely, he, just as the tradition, he recognizes natural law. For how could he otherwise say the command of natural law is to obey the positive law? So the difference between Hobbes and the tradition comes first to sight as a difference within the context of natural law. Now, what is that difference? In the epistle dedicative of his elements of law, natural and politic, Hobbes says, from the two principal parts of our nature, reason and passion, have proceeded two kinds of learning, mathematical and dogmatical. It is obvious that mathematics comes from reason and dogmatic from passion. The former is free from controversies and dispute because it consists in comparing figures and motion only, in which things truth and the interest of men oppose not each other. But in the later, in dogmatical learning, there is nothing not disputable, because it compares men, and meddles with their right and profit, in which, as oft as reason is against a man, so oft will a man be against reason. And from hence it cometh that they that have written of justice and policy in general, i.e. the political philosophers, do all invade each other and themselves with contradiction. In other words, there doesn't exist any political philosophy worthy of the name. To reduce this doctrine to the rules and infallibility of reason, there is no way but first to put such principles down for a foundation as passion, not mistrusting, may not seek to displace, and afterward to build thereon the truth of cases in the law of nature, which hitherto have been built in the air by degrees, till the whole be inexpugnable. So what is the difference? Traditional doctrine, political philosophy, was under the spell of passion, was under the spell, and therefore not rational. Well, as I say today, it was ideological. But there was nevertheless a reason which is slightly different. The foundations were wrongly laid because the principles laid down by Socrates and his successors were distrusted by passion. And Hobbes wants to reform, to revolutionize natural law doctrine, and thus make it a scientific doctrine for the first time by laying down foundations which are agreeable to passion, in harmony with passion. Natural law must be in harmony with the passions, not against them. That's the first, of course, very insufficient statement. Hobbes will be compelled to make a distinction between passions with which one must be in harmony and passions which must be followed. That is the second step. But the first point is the foundation must be a passion. This is the first point I would like to read to you. Now let me read to you another statement. In the same work, Elements of Law, Part 2, Chapter 9, heading of Section 8, when he speaks of the duties of government, the institution of youth in true morality and politics, necessary for keeping the subjects in peace. The subjects must be taught true morality. This is very traditional. But these elements of law, from which I quoted, are Hobbes' earliest work, which on the whole is the most traditional version. Let us see how he speaks in a later work on the citizen, how he calls it there. Of the Citizen, Chapter 13, Section 9, the heading. The correct institution of the citizens in political doctrine is necessary for the preservation of peace. Here he does not speak anymore of true morality. Shortly after him, a very great political thinker, of whom you will all have heard, John Locke, said, "However strange it may seem, the lawmaker hath nothing to do with moral virtues and vices," unquote, but only with security of life and limb and property. Now this is clearly implied already in Hobbes, and even stated to some extent, the government is concerned with nothing but the preservation of peace. Accordingly, moral virtue, in Hobbes' sense, is nothing but the human habits conducive to peace, peaceableness and all its implications. Virtues which have no direct relation to peace, such as courage, intelligence, wisdom, even temperance, are not strictly speaking moral virtues from Hobbes' point of view. Now, if we take these 2 points I mentioned together, building on the passions, narrowing down the sphere of moral virtue, so that moral virtue is nothing but the habits conducive to peace, we can say that what Hobbes achieved and wished to achieve was a lowering of the standards set up by Socrates and his successors. Of course, he believed that the older standards were foolish, but still, that is exactly part of the quarrel. Were they foolish? But if we take, at first glance, we see the standards are much lower, much more pedestrian. Winston Churchill somewhere speaks of low but solid grounds. This is a clear formulation of what was in the minds of men as hopes and law. Churchill didn't mean this, man. Low but solid versus high but unsolid, building in the air, as Hobbes said. This is a crucial part of the fundamental layer of modern political philosophy. Now, why is it necessary to lower the standards, as I call it? Let us consider a few remarks of Hobbes. In The Citizen, chapter 1, section 2, of those which have written something about states, the majority presuppose or assume or postulate that man is an animal born apt to society. The Greeks say zoon politikon, the political animal, and build on that foundation the civil doctrine and so on. And Hobbes tries to show that this is absurd, that man is by nature not apt for peace and peaceably living together, but rather the opposite. And he concludes this paragraph with the remark, the origin of great and lasting societies cannot be sought in men's mutual benevolence or friendliness, as Cicero, for example, said, but only in mutual fear. Man is by nature antisocial, which Hobbes identifies with asocial. As he puts it, nature dissociates man. And the fundamental error of the tradition was that it believes that nature made man by nature social. Nature is not a kind mother, but a stepmother, even an enemy. Now, this is quite obvious when you think of Hobbes' famous doctrine of the state of nature. Everyone has heard these beautiful 4 adjectives. And the state of nature is characterized by the fact that man's life is, I remember only 3 now. Solitary, thank you. Nasty, brutish, and short. This is a condition in which nature has placed us. All blessings of life we owe to action against nature, human action against nature. Now, another point connected with that is the following one, which Hobbes states most clearly in The Citizen, chapter 2, paragraph 1. Now, when he speaks about how the authors define the law of nature, and he says most people assume that the law of nature is identical with the common opinion of mankind, or at least of the wisest and most civilized nation. In other words, there is a natural understanding, a natural awareness of the principles of right and wrong. And this shows itself even in savage nations to some degree. Hobbes simply rejects it. No trust whatever in common opinion, in the common sense of the human race. And here we must remind ourselves that Hobbes was a contemporary, in a way a competitor with Descartes. Now Descartes laid the foundation for the enterprise of modern philosophy with his famous universal doubt, his doubt of everything. Hobbes absolutely agrees with this point of Descartes, that one must begin with the universal doubt. He even says in a somewhat unfriendly, non-magnanimous manner, as this is elementary. Everyone knows that. But what is the meaning of that? There have been doubters all the time. They were called skeptics. The difference between Descartes and the skeptics is this, that the skeptics drew the inference that human knowledge is not possible. And we have to live with these probabilities, with these guesses, as Mr. Popper seems to say now. But Descartes was the opposite of a skeptic. He believed if we want to have a solid foundation for science or philosophy, we must build on a foundation which is not exposed to any possible doubt, so that the extreme skepticism is the foundation for an absolutely watertight dogmatism. In this point, Hobbes is in fundamental agreement with Descartes. Now, among the arguments which Descartes uses in order to justify the universal doubt, the following is most revealing. He says there might be a very powerful evil genius who wishes to deceive us. Now, this might be the situation of our intellect, the situation of man. And therefore we must think as if this were the case, in order to be free even from the power of such a very powerful evil demon. And when someone says, well, this is, of course, there is no such evil demon, that's nonsense. Descartes says that doesn't make any difference, because if you speak of natural causes in the sense in which we now speak of it, of our perceptions and conceptions, they are as little concerned with our realizing the truth as this evil demon would be. No trust in our natural faculties. We have to find a new foundation. In some respect, Hobbes is even clearer here than Descartes. But the point which I wanted to make is that the lowering of the standards has to do with a profoundly changed posture toward nature. no trust in nature. Now, if we want to understand Hobbes somewhat better, we have to consider an earlier thinker to whom I have already referred, who stated the crucial point before Hobbes. As far as I remember, Hobbes never mentions him, and this is in itself quite interesting. You know, today it is customary that you quote or mention names, but in the past this was, in some writers at least, a very great art, whom to mention, whom to honor by mentioning him, and whom not to mention. The man I mean is Machiavelli. And here the fundamental text regarding modern political philosophy occurs in his Prince, chapter 15. It now remains to be seen what are the ways and rules for a prince as regards his subjects and friends, as distinguished from his enemies that he had discussed before. And as I know that many have written of this, I fear that my writing about it may be deemed presumptuous. You see, he's much more modest than Hobbes. Differing as I do, especially in this matter, from the opinion of others. He doesn't say of all others. But my intention being to write something of use to those who understand, it appears to be more proper to go to the real truth of the matter than to the imagination thereof. And many, he doesn't say all, have imagined republics and principalities which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done, the ordinary practice, for what ought to be done, will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. Therefore it is necessary for a prince who wishes to preserve himself to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge and not to use it according to the necessity of the case. In other words, the prince must use virtue and vice according to the circumstances. Good action is no longer virtuous action, but shrewd action. Here we have this decisive opposition of the two considerations. A political teaching which takes its bearings by how men ought to live, and a teaching which takes its bearing by how men do live. This is not the same as our present fact-value distinction, because Machiavelli's teaching is as normative as that of Plato. Only the norms are very different, because according to him, the Platonic or other norms are based on the assumption that men are good, and he starts from the opposite assumption, that at least most men are bad, which is a very inadequate analysis, of course, but I leave it as this for the time being. Now, in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 46, he quotes from a Roman historian, Sallustius, and in quoting Sallustius, he changes somewhat the text. And the prevalent view today is that he quoted from memory and has no importance. I have come to doubt of this assumption. At any rate, the passage as misquoted or amended by Machiavelli it means all evil stems from good beginnings. All evil stems from good beginnings. Now, surely the biblical view says that the beginnings were good, and Machiavelli, the relation to classical philosophy is somewhat more complicated. For all evil stems from good beginnings, i.e. we must start from bad beginnings if we want to build up a stable society. Well, this has become elementary in modern thought. The beginnings are bad, savage, pre-literate, underdeveloped, and what have you. At the beginning we can state Machiavelli's thought, at the beginning there was not love, but terror. And by opposing that fundamental terror, the terror of the state of nature in Hobbes' language, men build up civil society, and they will do it the better they know that they have to count only on themselves. Since he speaks of evil examples, I would like to remind you of what Machiavelli says about good examples. Good examples, Machiavelli says, arise from good education. And good education is a consequence of good laws. And good laws ultimately go back to good founders of societies or legislators. But who are these model founders? Well, men like Cesare Borgia, if this name means anything to you, or the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, whom Machiavelli himself calls a criminal, and a mixture of a fox and a lion. So, in other words, the roots of goodness, of that kind of goodness of which man is capable, are led by people who are the very opposite of good. Now, incidentally, the passage in which I read to you from the Prince, chapter 15, is used in Spinoza's political treatise, chapter 1. And here that is very interesting because Machiavelli is not, according to the official cataloging a philosopher, but Spinoza is, and Spinoza takes over this whole statement about the errors of the past and in what they consist. We have to take men as they are, to take our bearings by that. Now, colloquially or vulgarly, we may say what is characteristic of these men like Machiavelli and Hobbes is that they claim to oppose a realistic teaching to the idealistic teaching of the past. And I think, as a provisional formulation, this is even indispensable. But we must not forget, for one moment, that what they tried to do was to erect on this so-called realistic basis an ideal order. So much so that Hobbes, at the end of chapter 31 of the Leviathan, compares his Leviathan in a certain respect to Plato's Republic. It has this in common with Plato's Republic, that it is a blueprint of a perfect society. The perfection is much lower than that aspired to by Plato, but perfection it is. According to a very common view, this modern development was an idealistic development. Karl Becker wrote a book, The Heavenly City, in the 18th century. But what is forgotten here is the difference between the heavenly city of the 18th century and the heavenly city of Plato and Aristotle. That the foundations of the heavenly city of the 18th century were low. The foundations of the heavenly city of Plato and Aristotle were high. Plato and Aristotle, we may say, and of course that is true of the whole tradition of these great men, wanted to delineate the character of the just society by taking their bearings by man's perfection, by the highest in man. And these modern thinkers, trying to think in low but solid terms, try to take their bearings by the lowest, but for this very reason most powerful in man. The perfection of man, the highest perfection of man, is very rare, as everyone has admitted at all times. Therefore you can't count on it. But can you not find something which is very common, which you can find in every man or almost every man, very powerful? And if you build on that a civil society, then you have built on a solid foundation. Now this solid foundation is, according to Hobbes, man's urge, necessity to preserve himself, meaning the individual's urge to preserve himself. In other words, his fear of death, and more specifically, since we are speaking of social matters, his fear of violent death at the hands of other men. Hobbes is not particularly interested of death through to disease or illness. There are some very amusing documents of that. The only violent death which interests him is that coming from the hands of other men. Now, and the Hobbes waxes poetic when he begins to speak of this desire, of the fear of death and its majesty, as the solid foundation is similar. But speaking now wholly unpoetically, the fear of violent death is only the reverse side of the desire for self-preservation. In the traditional scheme, most clearly presented at this point by Thomas Aquinas, the desire for self-preservation is of course recognized as a fundamental inclination of man. But there is another one, the inclination towards society, which occupies a higher rank. And the third and highest is a desire for knowledge of God, or desire for knowledge generally speaking. These higher stories do not play any role in Hobbes' construction of civil society. And this only confirms what I said before, the lowering of the standards. The higher ones, they must somehow shift for themselves. There is another implication which I can only mention here, but I think I must mention it. In the traditional doctrine, especially as presented by Thomas Aquinas, these natural inclinations of man give rise primarily to duties. I mean, it goes without saying that self-preservation is a duty, as is shown by the fact that suicide is a sin. The rights are somehow derivative from the duties. This is radically changed in Hobbes. The fundamental phenomenon is not any duty, but the right to preserve myself, and any duties which come in are derivative from the fundamental right. And this you find nowhere with such clarity as in Hobbes. Here you can also see the, quote, realistic, unquote, character of this modern doctrine. That people should do their duties, one can only hope, but that they should be concerned with their rights and fight for them. This is a much safer more realistic assumption. In Edmund Burke, we find very beautiful remarks about this philosophy of the rights of man. As I quote from memory, the catechism of the rights of man is easily learned. The conclusions are in the passions. Don't have to think about it. But it would be more precise to say the premises are in the passions, and the passion of fear of final death. I must say something, as a matter of fact, quite a few things, about the developments after Hobbes. Otherwise, we will not understand the whole issue of the quarrel between the ancients and moderns and what is its subject, its fundamental subject. I must, of course, limit myself to the most telling and striking facts. I therefore will not speak now of Locke, but I will turn immediately to Rousseau, because Locke, however important he is in many respects, the fundamental scheme of Locke is not so different from that of Hobbes as one would assume. The practical consequences which Locke drew from them are totally different, we can say, from the practical conclusions which Hobbes drew, but the theoretical differences are not so great. I would like now to make a pause and see whether there is any point you would like to take up at this point that might help me to clarify it and might help also you to clarify yourself. Yes, Mr. Levy?
Just repeat once more the reasons why scientists want to know the history of science as shown by Einstein writing that book.
No, I mean, I said the mere fact, the brute fact. There is today a much greater interest in the history of science. In Wisconsin, there is an institute for the history of science. I do not know what the exact word is. Rather recently founded.
I just want to know what the reason for that is.
I believe it has something to do with the so-called crisis of modern thought, that certain things which were indubitable and a matter of course are no longer so. Whether that is a conscious motivation in every historian of science is a different story. Yes?
How is it that
which would compel us to qualify his statement? There was a tendency, and it still exists, I believe. I mean, you know, when people today who have no knowledge of earlier thought, well, say, no 19th and 20th century thought to some extent, and read Hobbes for the first time, and then it's of course all very outlandish, very medieval. And now they look at medieval texts and say, oh yes, there is much more medieval stuff in Hobbes. There's much more medieval than one would think. In the case of Spinoza, who was also a very revolutionary thinker, a very competent and a very learned man, has presented him as the last of the medievals. So why did these people make these mistakes? Because they didn't listen to what Hobbes and Spinoza themselves said about what they were doing.
I see that's why then you use this standard provision.
Yeah, sure, but I must say I believed Hobbes for quite some years until I began to understand Machiavelli. And then I saw that the fundamental step was taken by Machiavelli. With this not unimportant difference, that Machiavelli simply was uninterested in the whole issue of natural law or natural right, whereas Hobbes was. And therefore, Hobbes, as it were, tried to apply Machiavelli's insight, stated in this chapter 15 of The Prince. Let us take our bearings by how men live, and not by how they ought to live. Hobbes tried to apply this Machiavellian insight to natural law. And that is a peculiarity. But the first decisive step was taken by Machiavelli. But that took some time, I could explain, but that would really be better discussed in the seminar on Machiavelli than here. Good. So, now then I will turn to Rousseau. Because in Rousseau, this kind of political philosophy which Hobbes had started reached its first crisis. Rousseau's argument is in a way very simple. Hobbes had said man is by nature asocial, pre-social. And yet Hobbes took it for granted that these pre-social men who led this life, which was solitary, nasty, brutish and short, were able to enter civil society by making the social contract with one another. And Rousseau, as it were, says to Hobbes, look, if a man is by nature pre-social, then he is by nature pre-rational. He cannot have reason if he doesn't use language. And these people in the state of nature, each in his foxhole, and with no communication with the others, of course, would not have a common language. They might have common sounds, but not a common language. Therefore, Rousseau takes this grave step that he questions what Hobbes did not do, the traditional definition of man as a rational animal. Rationality is an acquisition of man. It does not belong to his nature. And he suggests provisionally, but very nevertheless importantly, says the true different definition of man is that man is a being endowed with freedom as distinguished from rationality. We will see later on that this was a very important and powerful change. Now, but if the state of nature is a state in which pre-social and pre-rational man is, that means in which man is the stupid animal, as Rousseau himself says, how can one gain a standard for human conduct by looking at man in the state of nature? That seems to be absurd. Furthermore, according to Hobbes, man has no natural end. That was understood in the whole tradition, in spite of certain difference of opinion, that man has a natural end, or rather a variety of ends, which however lead up to one highest end or highest good. Now I read to you what Hobbes has to say about this matter. Leviathan chapter 11 of the difference of manners. By manners I mean not here decency of behavior, as how one man should salute one another, or how a man should wash his mouth, or pick his teeth before company, and such other points of the small morals. But those qualities of mankind that concern their living together in peace and unity. In other words, ordinarily, I think Hobbes underestimates the importance of decent behavior for men living together in peace and unity. I don't want to, you easily know the examples, what men could do in company which would make the company unbearable. Well, to which end we are to consider that the felicity of this life consists not in the repose of a mind satisfied, for there is no such finis ultimus, utmost aim, nor summum bonum, greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. This keystone of the whole tradition out. There is no God. Nor can any man anymore live whose desires are at an end than he whose senses and imagination are at a stand. Felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one subject to another, object to another. The attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. So that in the first place, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. I think we can leave it at that. There is no highest good. There is nothing in which man's desire could find a repose and come to an end. But there must be, but this desire for power after power is of course infinite and only externally cut off by death. But we must have some fixed point to take our bearings. Since this cannot be found in the end of man, Hobbes finds it in the beginning, by which I do not mean a baby now born, but man at the beginning, man in the state of nature. This beginning is in a way the end, because by being so abysmally bad, it points away from itself to civil society. In a negative way, surely it is an end. Now, Rousseau goes much beyond this than Hobbes in this direction. For as I said, in Hobbes, the state of nature points towards civil society, but not in Rousseau. According to Rousseau, the state of nature is good, and then, hence, why should any sane individual wish to leave it? On the contrary, since the state of nature is good, and we do no longer live in the state of nature, the formula would rather be, let us return to the state of nature, which formula is used by Rousseau, and it needs a long commentary, but it is not entirely wrong. Incidentally, when Rousseau treats childhood with so unusual respect in his pedagogical work, the Emile, that has also to do with the questioning of teleology. From the traditional point of view, childhood is a preparation for adulthood. Childhood is teleologically ordered toward adulthood. But if there is no teleology, the childhood is as perfect as adulthood. And the child, therefore childhood is has a value for itself and not merely as a preparation. Now, the state of nature in Rousseau undergoes a variety of modifications of a fundamentally accidental character, and with the consequence that the state of nature becomes eventually little like Hobbes' state of nature, and therefore must be abandoned. And to that extent he rejoins Hobbes at this point. Yet, in spite of that, the state of nature remains the standard in Rousseau. The just civil society comes as close to the state of nature as civil society possibly can. For what is a peculiarity of the state of nature? That man is not subject to any authority, that he is free in this sense. Now, Rousseau's formula is that civil society, that by entering civil society, man must remain as free as he was theretofore, i.e., in the state of nature. Now, let us consider this somewhat more closely to understand that better. The construction of Hobbes was this: man has by nature the right to self-preservation. Therefore he must have the right to the means of self-preservation, say a stick, or gun or whatever, or for that matter also food, which was less important for Hobbes than it was for Locke. It's one of the great differences between the two men. And where Locke also is a more realistic one, as you see, because the use of all sticks in the world or guns in the world if you don't have food and water. But it requires, now this is then the key question in this argument. Means may be apt or inept. And a reasonable man would say, man, if he has a right to the means of self-preservation, is of course only the right to apt means of self-preservation. But here judgment comes in. Some people are good judges and others are bad. Who is going to judge of the means of self-preservation? The Hobbian answer, everyone must be the judge. And the reason is, and not merely the wise man, and the reasoning can be stated very simply as follows. The wise man has a better judgment, but he has much less interest in the self-preservation of the fool than the fool. Therefore, let the fool be the judge. Everyone is the judge. Now, Rousseau, starting from this, makes his crucial step beyond Hobbes and Locke. This right of the judgment of the means of self-preservation must be preserved within civil society, whereas Hobbes and Locke had said or implied this right to judge ceases in the moment men enter civil society. Now, what are these judgments on the means of self-preservation in civil society? What is their popular name? Laws. Therefore, according to Rousseau, justice demands that in civil society, everyone subject to the law must have had a say in the making of the laws. That's a strictly necessary consequence. This may be very just, but still, if everyone, if the majority are fools, as Rousseau would admit and even emphasize, what kind of laws will we get? If everyone has the same say as everybody else? Mind you, there is no representative or parliamentarian democracy here, but it's a direct democracy. Rousseau must therefore say that if this provision is accepted, the justice or reasonableness of the positive laws is guaranteed. If no one is subject to the law, who did not have a say in the making of the law, then the justice or reasonableness of the laws is guaranteed. In his terms, the general will, the will of the legislator, cannot err, or the sovereign is always what he ought to be. A sovereign, in the strict sense, can only be a community consisting of free and equal members. Otherwise it wouldn't be a sovereign, but a tyrant, according to Rousseau. Now, if this is so, if the general will cannot err, it follows that there is no possibility nor need for ever appealing from the positive law to the natural. Obviously, if you have a mechanism which produces invariably just and wise laws, you don't have to appeal from these laws ever to a higher law. A society constructed according to natural law, that is what Rousseau wants to say. A society constructed according to natural law never has to appeal to natural law. And this, of course, gives a high degree of legal clarity. Positive law is unquestionable from any consideration of justice. Here we see again in a different way that what I called the realism in quotation marks, the coincidence of the is and the ought. The sovereign is always what he ought to be, which when you hear it first sounds sheer insanity. According to the traditional view, man's desire must be subject to a vertical limitation. Here is man's desire, and then there comes a limitation from above, either from the divine will or from man's perfection. That does not make a clear difference. What Rousseau, and by implication Hobbes and Locke, have in mind is, this is out. This is, how did Machiavelli put it? This leads to the notion of imaginary principalities and imaginary commonwealth. For Machiavelli, the kingdom of God would of course also be an imaginary kingdom. The only limitation which we can trust is the horizontal, the will of others. The will of others. They will react and prevent us from oh God. Yes. I am reduced to the status of certain animals. In other words, vertical limitation is only an ought, and as powerless as oughts are. The vertical limitation, consisting in man's desire limited, the horizontal limitation, consisting in man's desire limited by the desires of his fellows, this is in principle sensible. But, of course, this can also lead in itself to chaos. My desires are thwarted by those of others, and I thwart those of others, etc. How can this be done rationally? That is Rousseau's question. Or this is only this is the same question, only in another formulation. Why is the general will beyond error? The answer of Rousseau is this: by generalization. But I have to explain it. I have desires, all kinds of silly, foolish, irrational desires. And the same is true of my fellows. But then we introduce a mechanism. We say the ultimate judgment of which desires are legitimate and which are illegitimate depends on the law. On a law for the making of which will depend on your vote as much as on that of anybody else. Simple example. I enter the assembly, the town meeting, with the irrational desire not to pay any taxes. I can't stand up and say, I don't want to pay no taxes. I have to say there ought to be a law that no one should pay any taxes. In other words, in the moment I conceive of my desire in terms of a law, in the moment I express my desire in the terms of a law, I become already more reasonable, to say the least, than I was before. So the generalization of my particular foolish vicious will is almost the fully sufficient remedy for my unreasonability. You see here again, from this example, here again I do not hold my desire against a natural law, an unwritten eternal law, what is sufficient to bring about justice, rationality, is the mere form, generality, and which is of course rationality. Reason always speaks in general or universal terms. In other words, the rational order, the order of the just society, is not the order according to nature in any sense. The natural order, as Rousseau understands it, is radically conventional, counter-rational, counter-natural. By nature, men are unequal, according to Rousseau. But the social contract replaces the natural inequality by conventional equality, and that is justice. You remember what I said before about certain changes regarding the concept of nature. Keep this in mind. I will later bring it together. Now, if this is so, if my will, my desire becomes rational by taking on the form of a law, then I may say by obeying the law, everyone obeys himself. He obeys the law which he has imposed upon himself. He is free because he does not obey any other man. Freedom, obeying the law which one has imposed on oneself, is self-determination. There is no reference to something outside of man in any manner and form. But there is a serious difficulty here which I would like to present to you in Rousseau's own words. Social Contract, Book 1, Chapter 8. This transition from the state of nature to the state of civil society produces in man a most remarkable change. It substitutes in his conduct justice for instinct and gives to his actions the morality which they previously lacked. In the state of nature there was no morality. Only at that moment does the voice of duty replace the physical impulse, and right replace appetite. And hence man, who hitherto had been only self-regarding, sees himself compelled to act on other principles and to consult his reason before listening to his inclinations. So the state of civil society is a state of reason, as Hobbes had said before. Although he deprives himself in this state of many advantages which he had from nature, against Hobbes, he regains therein so great ones. His faculties exercise themselves and develop themselves. His ideas extend. His sentiments become ennobled. His whole soul rises to such a point that if the misuses of that noble condition did not degrade man often beyond that state which he left, he would bless unceasingly the moment which liberated him from it forever, and which from a stupid and narrow animal made an intelligent being and a man, a human being. In other words, pre-social man, pre-political man, is not truly a man. Let us reduce this whole balance to terms easy to compare. What man loses by the social contract is his natural freedom and an unlimited right to everything which tempts him and on which he can lay his hands. What he gains is civil freedom and the property, the true ownership of that which he possesses, of everything he possesses. In order not to deceive oneself in these points, one must well distinguish the natural liberty, which has no limits except the forces of the individual, from the civil liberty, which is limited by the general will, i.e., by law. One could add to the acquisitions of the civil state a second point, moral liberty, which alone makes man truly master of himself. Moral liberty is not civil liberty, is more than civil liberty. For the impulse of appetite alone is slavery, and the obedience to the law which one has prescribed to oneself is liberty. But I have already said enough on this point, and the philosophic sense of the word liberty is here not my subject. Well, the difficulty here is this. Moral liberty is something very radically different from civil liberty. Civil liberty can be understood fundamentally in Hobbian terms as the derivative from self-preservation. Can this be done regarding moral liberty? In an important part of his Emile, the profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar, Rousseau has presented this issue of moral liberty in terms of a traditional spiritualistic or dualistic metaphysics. In other words, God and the soul as a substance, radically distinguished from body or matter. The question is, this concerns the status of this metaphysics. According to Rousseau himself, that metaphysics is exposed to insoluble objections. What is the tenable basis of moral freedom if it cannot be found in traditional dualistic metaphysics? This is the question. Rousseau has not developed this theme sufficiently, and one reason, and perhaps a decisive reason, is this: because Rousseau saw a moral alternative, if we may say so, to moral liberty, to the life of duty or of virtue. And this he called goodness. Goodness, as he understands it, is strictly natural, i.e. not acquired by human effort, and something fundamentally different from virtue and duty. To elaborate that would take an infinite time. By virtue of his doctrine of goodness, which one can call a very sentimental doctrine. Yeah? I mean, this kind of goodness which is perfectly compatible with doing rather terrible things, as Rousseau himself did. That he sent his children away to an orphanage was surely not a virtuous action, as he admitted, but it was perfectly compatible with his goodness. It gives you an idea of how far this goodness can lead. But however this may be, Rousseau's concern with this difference between goodness and virtue is the explanation, I believe, why he did not elaborate try to find a new basis for moral liberty as distinguished from civil liberty, and a basis different from traditional metaphysics. The man who did this on the basis of Rousseau was Kant, and we cannot understand the whole issue if we do not consider briefly at least a Kant solution to that problem. I see it is now time. I would like to mention only one point regarding Rousseau, which may explain the situation somewhat better. Hobbes had started from self-preservation, preservation of the existence of each as the fundamental thing. Again, Rousseau thinks here more deeply than Hobbes does on the Hobbian basis. He raises this question: do you not presuppose that life or existence is good if you attach to self-preservation, to preservation of life, the importance which you do attach to it? How do you know that life, sheer life, mere existence is good? Rousseau says, I know it. And he refers to something which he calls the sentiment of existence, in which man becomes aware, senses directly the goodness of life as life. It is possible that this is the first reference to the whole question of existence, which is now in the center of discussion. But at any rate, to keep to the issue of greatest concern to us, we shall follow up next time the problem of Rousseau by seeing in a very provisional manner how Kant solved Rousseau's problem and put therewith moral and political philosophy on an entirely new basis. And the net result of this will be so that, I think I should not keep you in a wholly unnecessary tension. The key point, the point which I am driving is this: the result of Kant's work is that from Kant on, the moral law is no longer a natural law, what it still was up to Kant. Nature has nothing whatever to do with morality, an exaggerated form, but a sufficient one. To live according to nature, which was a formula of the ancients, becomes a meaningless phrase. The depreciation of nature, which is already clearly visible in Hobbes, as seen in the very notion of state of nature as used by him, it becomes decisive for modern thinking, and this is the substantive reason why political philosophy, as originally understood by the classics, has become incredible. So in other words, after I have presented some important stages of modern thought, we are somewhat better prepared for understanding the beginning of classical political philosophy. So, yeah.